Stories are an integral part of the human experience. Think of all the great epic stories. Beowulf, where you heard about Beowulf for the first time in high school, part of English literature. The Iliad, the Odyssey, those great stories, epic stories. In our more recent times, we have the stories of Lord of the Rings and the Harry Potter series. All stories. And what child doesn't like a good bedtime story as they begin to doze off and maybe don't even hear the end of the story? And there are different levels of stories. In today's first reading, we hear a story about Abraham, and it's just not a story, it's a story of faith. And in the book of Genesis, we hear several stories about Abraham that are stories of faith. The first one we hear is when he's a very prosperous person in Ur of the Chaldees. And he gets this vision to pick everything up and move to a different place, move to a whole different land. He didn't have to. He wasn't being persecuted or anything like that. But he had this invitation to go to a new land. And so, not quite knowing what this new land looked like, he didn't have any reconnaissance drones or anything like that. He just picked up everything, his family, his flocks, and off they went. A second story of faith that we hear about Abraham is when these three visitors come to their tent, and they're conversing, and Abraham is showing, typical Mideast hospitality and all that. And then they make this promise to Abraham that he and his wife, Sarah, are going to have a child. If you remember the particular passage, Sarah started peeking out the tent and going, "Yeah, right." But the promise comes true. They have this child. Today's third story is a story again. Abraham has this vision to take his son Isaac, to go and sacrifice him. And he does. It's so counterintuitive for any parent to go sacrifice their son. But yet, out of faith, Abraham takes Isaac, puts him on this altar of sacrifice. He's ready to kill him. He's doing this all because he believes that somehow or another God will provide. God will provide. Stories of faith. In today's gospel, we hear about the transfiguration. But I think what we really need to look at is how this is part of the story of faith of Peter, James, and John. Their story begins when they're cleaning their nets, and there's an invitation to come and follow, come and see. Come and see what I have to offer. And they do. Their stories of faith continue as they see Jesus do incredible things. Cure people who've never seen, cure people who've never walked. Feeds the multitude. All stories that become part of their faith story. And today we hear about them experiencing the glorified Jesus. Again, a story of faith that they hold. That they hold because they're wondering as they come down the mountain, what does it mean to rise from the dead? Stories of faith. Which takes us to what are our stories of faith? What are those experiences we have in life of God calling us to something different? in the same way that he called Abraham to something different, to leave his comfortable life to go to this new land. What are our stories of faith when we hear about the impossible coming into our lives, in the same way that Sarah and Abraham experienced having their son? What are our stories of sacrifice, of giving up? Those are all part of our life experience. Those are our stories of faith, stories that we need to tell. The great thing about the early church is after Jesus died and rose and ascended, they began to tell those stories of faith. And we too are called to tell our stories of faith, because it is the movement of God in our lives. And by sharing those stories of faith, we continue to allow our brothers and sisters in faith to hear about the presence of God in our lives.